Okay, so we're going to start the webinar today. Thanks for coming. It's about 5 minutes about customer experience feedback. Just a quick note to make, there's a Q&A box at the bottom. You can type in that at any point during the webinar, and at the end we'll try and answer as many questions as we can. So without going on too much, I've got Phil Hearn with us here who's going to take you through this. So I'll pass you over now.
Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. If in your part of the world it's the afternoon. I know we've got people joining us from all around the world today. I think it includes some people from Singapore, where they actually had the Grand Prix yesterday, so I hope they've recovered from the excitement of that. First of all, a small apology from me. I've managed to get a sore throat just before this webinar, so I'm hoping my voice lasts out for the 30 minutes that I'll be speaking this morning. As Charlotte said, there'll be some questions and answers afterwards if you've got any questions that you want to submit at any point on anything that I say, or to ask for any other views. So just a very quick explanation on the first slide. Really, you'll see some of you will be more familiar with our company MRDC Software, which has been around for over 20 years, providing software to the market research market. In the course of that, we've become experts, if you like, in data collection of online data and delivering reports of data, and that really led us into the customer experience feedback business. That we spend quite a lot of time in that space now, because customer feedback really is just a combination of data collection and reporting. And we do put quite a lot of emphasis on the reporting side of things, although we're not really going to cover that in this webinar today. There will be another one in the series of customer experience feedback webinars that we're running, where we're going to focus more on the reporting and taking action from the feedback that you get. This is more looking at some myths that I think surround the whole customer experience feedback market, and looking at ways of getting the most from your feedback programs, and looking at things that what to focus on. So maybe the full title of this webinar should be 5 myths about customer experience feedback and what to focus on when you're conducting feedback. So CX Zebra is our specialist division, an offshoot of MRDC Software, that handles customer experience programs for a range of different companies around the world. We've got a mixed audience here today, and I'm quite comfortable with that. We have some research companies on this call, and some buyers of research, and that might be an unusual audience perhaps to broadcast to, but I feel quite comfortable with that. I think it's good to be transparent about what we think, about the ways we work with companies. So we do work for some research companies. We also have some companies who are looking to be our vendors in different countries around the world, and we also have some companies that we work for directly, providing customer feedback. So let's first of all then just look at what is customer experience feedback, and start at that point. And it's quite simply getting information from your customers so that you can react to it and improve your service. And if there's anything true at the moment, if you read blogs, attend conferences, attend webinars like this, you'll find that it's one of the key topics that everyone is talking about at the moment. Everyone is talking about customer experience, and saying as well things like customer experience is the key to profitability, and so on. So it's not something that's new, in my opinion. It's been around for many years, that it's perhaps being used as though it's something that's brand new, but it is, I believe, something that's increasingly important, that more attention's being paid to, and that customers are expecting a better experience more and more. And in turn with that, profitability of companies is coming or arriving at the doors of companies that are able to offer the best experience. So our business is very much in collecting data from customers and reporting that back. And as I said, I'm going to put that to one side, the reporting side of it. I think that's a different angle. I do believe strongly that there's some companies out there doing quite good customer feedback programs, but then aren't really making most use of the data. And just as an intro to that before I leave that topic to one side and cover it on a subsequent webinar that will be running later this year. I think making two things really, 2 points on reporting. I think making the data available to as wide an audience as possible, I think, is important. So it means then that everyone can react to that and be aware of what's important to customers. So making that data available, whether that be through reports, dashboards, or just some online access, I think is extremely important. And the other side of that, I think, is reporting meaningful data. I think too many companies just report back sort of some key figures or some key metrics, which I'll be coming on to in a minute in my 5 myths section of this webinar. I think it's important to put the data that's reported back in context with your business. So if you're getting customer feedback, you might want to measure that against sales, the type of store that you have, whatever's meaningful to your business, so that you can see the metrics that are being produced alongside other pertinent data that then allows you to see what actual objectives really have the best effect on your business. So let's just quickly look at some of the ways that feedback can be, you can get feedback. The most obvious and most common way is through surveys and polls. This is nothing new. Customer satisfaction questionnaires have certainly been around as long as I have in market research, so they're nothing new in the business. So surveys and polls continue to be a very good way of getting feedback. And of course, now that data can be collected so quickly via mobile phones and other ways of accessing customers, and we have customer details now through loyalty programs and so on, that is much more possible to achieve. The problem with that is, of course, that because respondents are so much more accessible, they're less willing to give their time now to answer long questionnaires, and so there are some disciplines that need to be in place to make sure that you maximize the information that could be available. A more modern growth area is text analytics. So it is now possible to get good analysis from text that's collected, whether that be through communications that are sent via computer, whether that be data that's available through social media analytics, which I'll come on to as a more specialist topic in a moment, or even things like call centers now. There's very good software that can take the text of conversations with call centers and convert that into text, so that text can be analyzed, and I'll be saying a little bit more about that, the analysis of text later. So text and speech and analytics sort of go together really, because they end up as the same thing as text. And social media analytics, of course, another way. So there's a lot of data, if you like, that's available through Twitter and forums and walls in Facebook and so on, and that will be covered again a little bit later in a bit more detail. Online tracking through websites is a way that you can also get more information out of people. You can see now what you can track, what people are doing around your website. So if they've registered with you in some way, you can then go on from there and see what information they're looking at to get a profile of that customer, and that's something that's used. Loyalty cards are another way of tracking people's behavior. So there's very many ways of getting data these days. Talking to customers is one that I always put in there. I had someone, a company, come to us who hadn't really done any customer feedback before, and they didn't know really where to start. And the suggestion I had was, rather than spend any money, was to just go into one of their stores actually and just ask people to get some ideas of what it was that was pleasing and displeasing their customers. So just talking to customers can be a good way of doing that. And that, of course, can be done in online communities nowadays. If you've got details of customers, you can recruit them to online communities. And that's a very powerful way of getting a nice mix of survey data and depth data, where you can ask specific questions and discuss topics or new services, etc., in some detail. So there's a real variety of ways of getting data from people these days that you can then go and use. Now, of course, bad customer service is something that we're all scared of offering, and there's no doubt that causes anger. And apologies for the picture here. My wife tells me that this is not a picture of me when I look angry. This is more a picture that or a face I might pull when I'm playing with grandchildren. But actually, it was my attempt to get a picture of anger. But anger can be a real problem, and you can get some of that angry data from social media. People are very prone to typing their complaints if there's a problem. I recently did it with Twitter. I had a problem with an airline, and I used Twitter to actually get somewhere with an organisation who had let me down badly. And of course, bad customer service can also cause frustration. So there might be pain points in a process, which again, social media can offer you a way of finding out what they are. So let's look at why customer feedback is important, and then look at some of the myths, and then look at some of the things that we can do to give you perhaps really good value from your customer feedback programs. Of course, the important thing is to ensure that you are meeting your customers' needs. It sort of goes without saying, that's nothing new. That's something that's been around ever since the beginning of customers have ever been around. So that's one thing that we need to measure to make sure that you're meeting their needs. A consistent service is something I think that some companies struggle with, and if you've got a consistent service, that might be a way of retaining your customers. It can be possible to have a good service, but if it's inconsistent or certain members of staff aren't following a way of actually working with your customers, that can mean that the service is inconsistent. And there's that threat that if you don't get it right, if you don't get your customer service right, somebody else will do it and you will lose business. So there's also a need to give good value, of course, but really when it comes down to all these things, what makes good customer feedback? It's all about common sense to a great extent, and one of the things that comes up, and we talk to customers quite a lot, is we talk about what might actually improve the customer experience with their clients. And when they talk about this, one of the things that comes out for me is I find there's some things that actually cost them no money to implement, which begs the question, well, why not just implement it? If you know there's something you can do that costs nothing, why not do it? And if it's going to improve the customer experience. And it does come to a question of cost sometimes. Improving a customer experience in many cases will cost more money, cost you money, which is a threat, because it could mean that you diminish your profits. But of course, if that means retaining customers or avoids losing customers to other companies, it might be something you have to do, and to look at how you can bear that cost. If something costs just a little, does it really improve the customer experience? If it costs a lot, it obviously needs a lot of consideration and testing. Certainly one of the techniques that are used a lot on websites, where you're looking to measure customer experience for people who are doing things online with your company, is doing A/B testing, for example. So setting up their website so that half people see one version and half see another, and you can test whether that actually which preference people have, and then when they choose between A or B, you can then do two versions of that and choose between that, and you can get then a service that is being optimized in a very simple way. And that can work well with when you're interacting with customers and providing that sort of service. And if we look at what customer experience is about, I liked an analogy, and I've stolen this from someone else. I like the analogy of sort of imagining that what your job is to guide someone to buying your product. If you imagine that your whole objective is to get someone to the door at the far end of that corridor, and they become a customer, but all the way down that corridor, there are doors where there's reasons for people not to buy from you. You're trying to guide them past all those doors to get them to that last door where they actually spend money with you. So I think that's a good way of looking at customer experience. So how can we measure success? Surveys is certainly one way of doing that, and that's one of the things that we've been involved in for many years. And now with the ability to put surveys on a mobile phone here, just like the Walrus clothes store, it's very easy to have a short survey that respondents can fill in to give you immediate, in-the-moment feedback, having made a transaction with you, or having had some touch point where they've come in contact with you. And surveys are very good for this, but they must be short. You can't really have long surveys. People's willingness to answer long surveys is long gone in many cases. And as we said earlier, in the different methods of collecting data, surveys aren't the only way of collecting data. You can get feedback from all these other methods, from social media, communities, and so on. So let's look at some of the myths surrounding customer experience, and then go on to some of the solutions that we put in place and some of the things that we think can maximize the return on your investment when you come to spend money on customer experience programs. So the first one is one that I do feel quite strongly about, and it's something that I keep reading about. And every time I read it on various forums, and I often challenge it. People, to be fair, challenge me back, but I'm going to say it here. And one of the things that you read in many places is that the Net Promoter Score is your route to profitability. Now, when I was misquoted, when I wrote a blog article about this some time ago, and someone kindly misquoted me, saying I said something completely different to what I actually said. Yes, there will be a correlation between Net Promoter Score and your profitability, but it might not be everything. So what is Net Promoter Score? For those who are not familiar with it, Net Promoter Score asks a question whether you would recommend a product or service to a friend or colleague, and it asks you to score that between 0 and 10, and that one single question, and only that question, is then used to group you into one of 3 places. So each respondent gets put down as a 9 and 10 gets coded or treated as a promoter. 7s and 8s get treated as passives, and anybody between 0 and 6 is treated as a detractor. Now, the arguments are, you see some of the software suppliers like SurveyMonkey saying, well, this is the leading CX measure and it's the all-important one. You see many research companies, and I've even read Harvard have said things about this, that the great thing about promoters are that they renew, they expand, they'll forgive you for any mistakes that you make. And there is no doubt a correlation that it's obviously better to have promoters than there is detractors, and that's where I was misquoted from a blog article that I wrote recently. You obviously want people up the top end, but it might not be the be-all and end-all, and it might not actually give you a guide to how good your business is and whether your customer experience is what it should be, and whether your business is vulnerable or not. You could get very complacent, I think, if you had a good Net Promoter Score, a high Net Promoter Score, but that complacency might be misplaced. And conversely, you could have not such a good score and actually still be in a very strong position, because it would depend on the industry that you're in. So Net Promoter Score is simply promoters minus the detractors. It's that percentage of promoters subtracted and subtracted from that the detractors, and that has a place. It will correlate to some extent in many cases with profitability, but it doesn't necessarily. We've already looked at the whole business. If to improve the customer experience significantly is an expensive thing to do, well, that might mean that actually you might get a high promoter score, but you might be going out of business because you've raised your costs too much and can't be competitive, or your costs are too high and removing your profit. So that needs to be something that you need to bill in what cost it comes at. And also, I think it can lead to complacency if you're not careful. I'll give a very good example of this, and it's one that relates actually to this webinar right now. This webinar, as you will realise, is being conducted through Zoom, who I have a very high opinion of, and I would no doubt call them a promoter. but probably 1 year ago, and only 1 year ago, we used to use WebEx rather than Zoom, and I would have been a promoter of WebEx at the time. It was only when I became aware of Zoom that I decided that Zoom, at half the price and being actually better than the WebEx platform, was better for us to run webinars on Zoom. And so a year ago, and probably slightly less, I would have been a promoter of WebEx, and now I'm an old customer. I've gone, and they won't get my business back, I shouldn't think, unless they really improve their platform and make it cheaper and better than the one I'm working on, or we're working on now. So there's some care needed with being a promoter. You can look like you're a promoter. I would have recommended WebEx a year ago. Now I've gone. I was never a detractor at any point. Overnight, I switched my loyalty to another company, and WebEx get our business now. And I think it depends with Net Promoter Score, what's important to your business. And here's an example of a Net Promoter Score. So we're looking at comparing two scenarios here, where in one case, 50% are promoters, 10% are passives, and 40% are detractors, which gives a Net Promoter Score of 10. In another case, it's 30, 60, 10, which gives an NPS of 20. Now, which is better? Now, on the surface, NPS will tell you that the second one is obviously better because it's 20%, but that might not be the case. There is a lot of talk about, there are Marmite brands out there where actually you don't mind if there's a lot of detractors, if there's a lot of promoters. And it would depend whether your brand is in the public domain a lot. So someone like Coca-Cola or McDonald's probably wouldn't want a lot of detractors out there, because that would start to impact on their business if there are a high number of detractors. Whereas I don't know, a company that sells a product that really no one else hears about, or their their potential clients don't really hear about, which covers a lot of small to medium, and even large businesses. Having more promoters might be all you want. All you want are people who actually want your product, and so on. And I do question the whole concept of recommending a service or product to a family friend or relative or whatever it might be. I don't know about you, but there's some things that I'm quite passionate about that I might talk to when I'm at a social occasion, and would recommend to a family or friend member. But there are certain things where I perhaps don't feel very passionate about it. It's not a very emotive type of service or product that I buy, and I probably wouldn't recommend them to anybody because I'm just not sufficiently knowledgeable or interested in that market. So I think, there are places where that question works quite well, but there are a lot of places, and probably more places, where the question of recommendation doesn't work very well, because you might never see yourself in a scenario where you would recommend that particular product or service, or you perhaps perceive a market where all the players in that market are about the same. I'm certainly aware of markets like the banking industry where banks find it quite hard to differentiate between themselves, and many people, not everybody, many people feel they're all about the same. And so recommending, probably not. You might score that quite low, even though you're quite comfortable with that particular supplier and had no real intention of ever changing brand. And you can make extremes of this. You could say, okay, well, the extreme of this is I've got 50% promoters and 50% detractors. And if everybody's in that passive category of 98%, as shown in that comparison, that's probably it might not be very good, but in another case, that might be absolutely fine. And the detractors group of 0 to 6, I have some concerns about as well, in that a lot of our businesses selling software, I expect there are quite a few people some people who use our software who are perhaps occasional users. They're satisfied with it generally. They wouldn't perhaps want to go out and say it's important to their life because it's not one of the main things in their job. And they might score that at 6. And I'd be disappointed with that, because I'd like to see them up the 7, 8, 9, 10 end of the scale. But I'd be much more concerned if they were down the 0 end of the scale. That would mean they really didn't like the product that we were offering. And so I think 0 to 6 is far too big a range to put people into detractors. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about as a myth within that NPS is the be all and end all. I think it has a place. I don't think it's rubbish, as I was wrongly quoted, but I think it has a limited use. Another topic that I've discussed as well on online forums and in blog articles is that there's a myth that price has nothing to do with customer experience, and I challenge that as well. It depends whether if what you're buying and what you're doing, but for example, I lost a hammer recently and I had to go to a hardware store to buy a new one. It was a really unemotive process. I really, as long as the shop stored what I wanted it and it was convenient, I really didn't care what it cost. I just wanted a replacement hammer because I lost my hammer. And something as low price as that, where price wasn't very important, I wasn't looking for a great customer experience. I just wanted something convenient. And indeed, the hardware store was fine, and price there wasn't important. If I'm buying a $200,000 car like the one on the left there, I might expect a really good experience. I might expect everything to be really a good service from start to finish, even down to the detail of I'd like a full tank of petrol when I drive it away from the showroom, because that could be something that would be a deal breaker if I didn't get that little bit of extra service having spent that much money. It isn't always to do with money, because I think there's also another factor in here, in that pleasure of the purchase and pain of the purchase can also have a really significant effect here. There are purchases that we make that are painful, where we don't particularly enjoy spending that money, against purchases where there's some fun element to it and our expectation as a result of that changes. So convenience, expectation become quite important questions when it comes to customer experience. The third myth is mapping the customer journey. I went to the Results and Research Conference in Germany last year, their annual conference and exhibition, and nearly every company in the research field was talking about mapping the customer journey. I talked to a few customers about how they mapped it, and I was less convinced actually in what they were doing. I think they were trying to say, rather than mapping the customer journey, they were just trying to find all the touch points and catch as many as they could have in most cases. It's a complex business, mapping the customer journey. If you're going to map all the different places where there might be a touch point, it is incredibly difficult and it's incredibly expensive to do, unless you take some of the steps to keep that cost down. And I believe a lot in deal breakers, in that you can be totally happy with a company, but if there's a deal breaker in there, it doesn't matter what they do, they're not going to come back in your consideration as a potential supplier. I give an example of that. There's an airline, I won't name who they are, but they send me about 4 mail shots a week, and whether I unsubscribe or not, I still seem to get them. I even called them once to say, can you take me off your mailing list, because I know who you are, and if I want you, I'll just book a flight with you. But actually, they've irritated me so much now that I won't use them anymore. And I think they're actually quite a good airline, but they just won't actually deal with something that's irritating me. Now, that's a very low-scale problem that probably wouldn't have been picked up by most research that one might do for customer experience, but there's a deal breaker in there. And to pick up deal breakers, things like social media analysis are very good ways of finding out what is irking people and what is causing them to not buy from them. So I look at those sorts of things. Communities can be another. Call center analysis of conversations that are held at call centers can also pick that sort of thing out as well. Another thing that I hear is that social media analytics are unreliable and inaccurate. Now, this isn't quite such a myth, actually, and maybe I shouldn't put it down as myth number 4, because actually it is true in a lot of cases. What the real title of this slide should be is that most social media analytics unreliable and inaccurate, and that's not the myth, that is the truth. There's about 1,000 companies now, I think, that are measuring social media data, taking data from Twitter forums, Facebook walls, and so on, and analysing that using text analytics. The vast majority of those 1,000, I would say over 990 of them are producing poor quality data, which is why it isn't really quite such a myth, because a lot of social media analysis is quite poor. We do offer social listening or social media and analytics, and we're one of the small number who do it properly and do it to a high standard, and we think actually our standard is higher than the others. And there's a webinar on that topic if you want to follow that, which we'll send out to you with the notes after this webinar here. But social media analytics really do need to be done properly. Just as a brief introduction to the sorts of things that are important, is that there's a lot of generic models that analyze a text generically. So there's one model for any product field, and it really is not rocket science, but really text and analytics must take in the product field, because there's always buzzwords and keywords that only apply to that particular product field or service area, which have to be programmed in and have to be used in analyzing the text that you're getting from social media. So that's the first thing that I would say. And that model, before it is trained, before the data is trained to produce results which show you what topics and what subtopics and what emotions are coming out, that data needs to be trained so that it can be checked back and it's working to 85–90% accuracy, whereas many of the social media analytics tools are not checked back. They're probably producing somewhere between 30–50% accuracy, which in my opinion is just not good enough. So the methodology that we apply is that we would code or codify a sample of the data, then apply that model to train the data, having trained the data, and then check back again to make sure it's producing accurately, automatically coded data using artificial intelligence for that particular product field. So that's something I think is quite important, that this particular sector's got a bad name rather than it being a myth perhaps here, but the sector's got a bad name because there are so many tools that do a fairly rough and ready job, whereas there's only a small number that do what I call a professional job up to research industry standards. The fifth myth, which I'm going to come to, is that in-depth customer surveys reveal the real issues. The problem with detailed questionnaires such as this one here is that they might miss a detail, or they might be highlighting something that really doesn't matter. I stayed in a hotel a couple of weeks ago, and I got a questionnaire 2 weeks after being at the hotel, asking me a whole battery of questions about the room. And one of the questions, or some of the questions, just were irrelevant to me. I was asked whether the lighting in my room was what was from a scale of 0 to 10, and I couldn't really remember anything much about the room, whether the lighting was good or not. So I just gave it a random score in the middle, I think, of 5. I can't remember what I scored. I might have scored it 10 because it was fine, or I might have scored it in the middle because I was fairly neutral about it. I really can't remember. In other words, my response was fairly random and really not very informative and hardly thought out. So in-depth surveys, I think, don't work for in-the-moment research. If you want to do customer feedback, you want to get someone soon after they've completed a transaction, perhaps not too quickly. I went through immigration recently, or check-in at Gatwick Airport recently in London, and I got a questionnaire before it hardly cleared security, asking me what the experience was like, and I hardly had time to get my shoes back on, having gone through security checks. So there's also a limit the other way, but certainly you want to get that in the moment experience, and you want a short survey. If you feel that it's important to ask more depth, I don't think there's any problem in offering people a longer survey that they can take, but keep the questionnaire short if possible. So some things that we recommend. we're coming out the myths now and what things we think can help you. Find the deal breakers. I think social media analytics and communities are a good way of finding deal breakers. Survey questions, keep it short. We think the 4 key things are not recommendation. I think they're satisfaction, which sort of goes without saying, which is the old question that everyone's asked in market research for many years. But expectation is extremely important. It's okay if you're. It can be. You could have vulnerable customers who are very satisfied, but actually, if they're expecting more than that, that can mean that your business is quite vulnerable. And convenience could be all it's about for some people, depending on what your product or service is. Convenience might be the all-important thing. So you could be only moderately satisfied, but if the service is convenient, if you're getting top score for convenience, that could be good enough, and that could be all that people want from you. And as I say, there is this debate over whether price is important. I think it is important. It governs our expectation. If we sometimes buy things that we think are quite expensive, which means our expectation is high. If our expectation is met, that might mean we come back and we don't want to buy another product. And if you're not in a market that's price sensitive, looking at the competition and how much competition there is and whether that's growing or whether there's disruptive technology in play that might take away business from you, looking at competition, I think, is quite important. And customer comments can give you some real nuggets of data. I do believe even on surveys, short questionnaires, it's not a bad idea to have one question or any comments you'd like to make. A lot of people will ignore that question, but you can get some real nuggets of information in there that can tell you something you never thought about, which interestingly can be very cheap to fix. Some of those things that come out of those types of questions can tell you something that you're just not thought of, that you can easily fix at almost no cost and improve that customer experience. So I think customer comments are important, and of course any communities will give you things like customer comments very easily. So how to get good ROI? We've covered most of these things in the various points in this webinar, and we'll be coming to questions shortly. Keeping the questionnaire short, I think, if you want in the moment experience feedback, you need to keep that too. I would recommend the 4 questions I mentioned just now, with an open comments question. I think that's enough. If you really feel you want to get the net promoter score, you could ask that as well. And again, it's okay if you've got something that's new to your product or service, you might want to ask another question. But with each question that you ask, the more you're going to risk that people aren't going to complete your questionnaire, and you're going to water down the quality of your data and the chances of people completing it, your survey. So be hard on yourself rather than saying, well, I can just add another 4 or 5 questions. Tempting as it might be, you're less likely to get the data you want and the measurements that I think you should be taking on a regular basis. So ask those key questions. I think I mentioned at the beginning, getting reporting that is useful to you. I think too many companies do just supply sort of standard reports or a PowerPoint presentation, which probably doesn't tell you what you want to know. Merging your key metrics, your KPIs with customer feedback data, I think can give you some really good insights, which mean you get the maximum value from your customer experience programs. Dashboards and downloadable reports are a good way of doing that. And as I mentioned, finally, only use good quality social media analytics, because some of the cheap ones out there really don't give you very much. If you just want inaccurate data, well, it's it's really not worth doing, I don't think. So my advice is not to spend more than you need to. I think too many people spend more than they need to. Certainly if you're new to the business, don't spend too much. Start with a short online survey, which we can carry out, certainly that sort of thing, at a pretty low cost per month, so you can get continuous feedback and monitor how that's doing and how change is working or not working for you. but please ask us what will work for you, and we can probably come to some way of maximising what it is you get from your customer experience programs. So that's all from me. I'm Phil Hearn, as you probably know. I'm a CX Zebra. I don't look angry all the time, but I'm now going to just pass back to Charlotte to see whether there's any questions that have come in either during the webinar, or if you've just thought of some now, please type away into that box that you can put in questions, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. So over to you, Charlotte. Any questions coming?
Yep. Yeah,
okay.
We do. Yeah.
Okay, good.
I'll start working through. We've got a few here now. The first one we've got is, do you think NPS should not be measured at all?
I'd almost go as far as to say yes on that. If it's something that you've measured in the past and you want to monitor it, it's yet another measure that you can use. I think my main point is that I don't think you should put everything on NPS. I know there's a company in America that just trades on NPS being the only thing, the only measure that you should take. And if you get that going upwards, your profits will go upwards. Well, I think that's far too simplistic. If you've always had that, if you've been collecting that data for some period of time and it's a measure that you value, by all means, still collect that information, because it's another measure that you can compare progress or obviously not progress. But I think the other measures are more important. So for comparative purposes, yes, keep it if you need it, but I don't think you should put all your eggs into that basket, to use an expression.
Okay, thank you. Yep, another one here. So how can you calculate cost of improving CX versus benefit to business profit?
That's quite a difficult question, and quite a long topic, I guess. I think you can. You should know what the cost of implementing each improvement costs, and as I said in the webinar, that can be nothing to obviously quite a large sum of money. You could lavish gifts on your customers, and I'm sure they'll like you more. But you obviously got to gauge that against the benefit to your business. A/B testing is quite a good way of doing things, in that giving half your customers or just 5%, depending on whether it's a cost, if it's an expensive thing to provide, it will depend what the improvement is. I think if it's something that you can provide cheaply to 5%, in other words, it's a 20th of the cost of providing it to all your customers, you can provide that improvement in service maybe to 5% of your customers, and see whether what their feedback is, and whether they feel there's improvements in your service, and their feedback improves. So I think it depends on the cost of the improvement, and whether it's something you have to roll out to all customers, or whether it's something you can do some testing on, or whether you can do A/B testing, as I described in the webinar. Perhaps I'd say the person who's actually sent that question is a good question, and not easy to answer with a trite answer in a webinar like this. If they want to get in contact with myself or Charlotte, we'll answer your particular point there in a bit more detail after this webinar, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. Is satisfaction and expectation better than recommendations to friends as a measure?
Well, yes. I mean, I covered this earlier. I think recommendation to friends is a funny question. It has too many things wrapped up in it. Is it something you're emotive about, or is it a non-emotive product? So something I can only judge by my own standards, because other people will have other things. I find something like insurance an unemotive thing that I just buy, and I can't imagine ever recommending, because I just sort of without knowledge of the industry or great knowledge, I find the players very similar, all offering something, so I'm probably buying on price more than anything else. With a little bit of reputation, perhaps some of the bigger companies. Whereas there's other things where I might be quite emotive about, where I might recommend. So I'm more likely to recommend things. I'm very interested in sport, for example. So I might, if it's something to do with football or something to do with my experience at a football stadium, I'll be much more emotive about that, and would want to communicate that. So I think recommending to friends is a loaded or a difficult question. Doesn't really get over what really matters, and because when it comes down to consuming a product or service, I think it's about the mixture of your satisfaction and whether you expected better than that or not. And if you haven't met expectation, I think that's generally worse. The worst thing that can happen, and that would be true of our customers in our business. That we would hope we at least meet their expectations and hopefully exceed them. And you know, there are exceptions for that, and that's why I gave that example of where convenience is sometimes the be all and end all. That's the most important metric. So yes, I think recommendation can work in some fields. It might work for the mega brands like Coca-Cola, where you wouldn't want too many detractors of Coca-Cola, because that is something that probably is talked about amongst people more. Well, if it got in the press, that would be disadvantageous. So yeah, I think it varies product to product, but I think satisfaction and expectation are very much better measures. Yes.
Okay, got another one here. We track performance with 20 to 25-minute customer satisfaction surveys quarterly. Why are short surveys better?
Different is what I would say. Customer satisfaction surveys that are 25-minute questionnaires are a way of getting people's sort of objective view of a business or a product or a service. You'll find from those sorts of surveys that in many cases that the figures won't change much quarter to quarter, because people are in a very objective mode when they're doing those sorts of surveys. These short surveys are really about getting at the customer experience, and a customer experience, you can only really get that feedback if you get it quickly after there's been a transaction or there's been some touch point. So they're giving different data and different information, and if you're doing something well, or you know, that might get watered down in a customer satisfaction survey that's conducted quarterly. If you ask someone, or badly, by the way, well or badly, if you're asking someone directly after they've visited you in a restaurant, for example, you're going to get in the moment and know whether their expectation was met or not, and so on. Asking me whether my expectation was met 6 months ago or 3 months ago, if it's a quarterly survey, might be quite difficult. You might get some of the image of the company and that sort of thing, but you wouldn't get the accurate feedback from the transaction.
Okay.
That was the question.
Thank you. Just got a couple more here to get through. I liked your point about price does affect customer experience due to expectation. Where price isn't a major part of the decision process, do you still measure this?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, I think price is generally an important part in there, because it as you noted, affects expectation. There are markets where they aren't price sensitive, either because it may be a luxury good where people aren't really worried what it costs. They just want a brand or whatever it might be, and there are other ones where the price is insignificant, or it doesn't really come into the equation particularly. It might be just the service you want. So where there's price insensitivity, we recommend that question is actually changed to look at the competition and how strong the competition is. So there are times where there are particular markets where price point isn't really the issue. It's just whether there's serious competition and other brands or services that might be considered as being serious competitors. So we would reword that question where price is not such an issue, and look at competition.
Okay, I've got one more here. We use industry norms to ensure NPS is good. Do we need all the other measures you are suggesting if we have industry norms?
Okay, this is a common a disagreement that perhaps I have with industry norms are a way that many of the companies that are trading on NPS and NPS only operate. They say, well, we've got the industry norms. So let's say the industry norm is an NPS of 30. If you're achieving 40, well, you're doing well. If you're doing 20, you're not doing well enough, so you need to improve it. And to a point, that sounds very convincing and is okay. Where it is okay is where all the suppliers in that, or all the potential suppliers in that market, are offering the same thing, more or less, because then the industry norm sort of is a good measure, because if everyone's trying to supply exactly the same thing, to be above or below what the industry norm is will tell you whether you're doing well or not. However, that might be too simplistic. If you're in a market where the industry norm is 30, just to go back to that example, the fact that you're scoring 40 or 20 might not say how vulnerable or how strong your business is, and whether your customer experience is good enough or exceeding expectations. So in a market where there's perhaps several players and an industry norm is 30, but some of those are selling on price, some are selling on quality of service, some are on convenience, some are doing it some other way, maybe online against others that are not doing their service online, or whatever it might be, then I think it's not good enough. That just to say you're beating the industry norm is not good enough, because it just means that you're at this stage, at this moment, you're doing better than the competition, but that doesn't mean you're not vulnerable, and that could change quickly, and that you should do something to improve your service still, and that it's not vulnerable to competition and so on. So I think it's if you're in a market where all the players are offering the same thing, I think that's it's less of an issue. But I think that's rarely the case. More and more suppliers in a market are offering something different these days, and trying to be different as well. So I think it's a dangerous thing, again, just to stick with NPS as the one measure, which I think is what the question is basically.
That's everything on the question side.
Okay, well, in that case, we'll wrap up now. Thank you very much for attending. It's been a good mixed audience today. We've attracted here today, which is good. Any questions that you have after this event, I'll be more than happy to answer. There's my email address sitting there in front of you now. After this webinar, Charlotte will be distributing the video of this and one or two other materials and this PowerPoint to you, so that you can look through that and ask any more questions. But we'd be pleased to help in any way we can with anything about your customer experience feedback. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.